Listen, for 42 years of marriage, my husband, Harold, he had this ritual, a sacred thing, you know? Every blessed Thursday, he'd go to the bank. And it wasn't just any old time, no, it was always precisely at 4:15 in the afternoon. Not a minute sooner, not a minute later. He was an accountant, you see, a man of numbers and routines, and this one was the most rigid of them all. At first, I thought it was just a little peculiar. Then, it just became part of the scenery of our lives. And whenever I asked him, especially when we were younger, "Harold, honey, why every Thursday at that exact same time? Is something special going on?" He'd do the same thing. He'd stop whatever he was doing, walk over to me, and give me a kiss on the forehead with a tenderness that felt like the most genuine thing in the world. And he'd say that same line in that calm, gentle voice of his, "I'm just securing our future, darling." And I, Dorothy, a 63-year-old retired teacher, oh, I believed him, with my whole heart. Of course I did. But for you to understand how this innocent little ritual, this thing I thought was proof of his care and responsibility, was really hiding a nightmare that would destroy everything I'd built over more than 4 decades. Well, I need to back up a bit. I need to tell you what my life was like before it all came tumbling down. Before I found out that the man sleeping next to me every night, the father of my children, was a liar, a thief, and that he hadn't stolen from strangers, but from his very own family. My name is Dorothy Mitchell. I was born and raised right here in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a neighborhood where everybody knows everybody, you know? The kind of place where you leave your front door unlocked and the neighbors just pop in for coffee without even calling. I worked as an English literature teacher at Roosevelt High School for 29 years, and I loved that job. I loved seeing the students' eyes light up when they finally understood Shakespeare, when they fell in love with Maya Angelou, when they discovered that books could change their lives. I retired 5 years ago, but to this day, I still run into former students at the grocery store who come up to give me a hug and tell me they became teachers, lawyers, doctors. I met Harold when I was 21. I was standing in line at the post office, mailing letters to my folks who'd moved down to Wilmington, when he walked through the door. Tall, sharp-looking, glasses, carrying one of those expensive-looking leather briefcases. He tripped on the welcome mat and dropped every last paper he was carrying. Documents just went flying everywhere. And me, always a little too helpful for my own good, I left my spot in line and went to help him. We were both down there on the floor, gathering up these sheets full of numbers and charts, and he was just so embarrassed, apologizing over and over. When we were done, he thanked me with this shy little smile and asked me to coffee. I said yes. 2 weeks later, we had our first real dinner. 6 months after that, he proposed in a small, cozy little Italian place downtown. And I said yes without a second thought. Harold was an accountant. He worked for a respected firm, Patterson & Klein, down in the financial district. He was good at what he did, meticulous, organized. Everyone said he was trustworthy, that he had a real head for numbers. And I felt lucky, you know? I felt safe. While some of my friends were complaining that their husbands spent too much or didn't even know where the credit card bill was, I had Harold. Harold, who took care of everything. Harold, who balanced our checkbook every month. Harold, who assured me we were on the right track. We got married in a beautiful ceremony at Trinity Methodist Church, with all our friends and family, everyone we loved. We started our life in a small but cozy rental house, and we saved our money bit by bit. Me with my teacher's salary, which was never much, but it was honest. Him with his accountant's salary. We scrimped and saved, passed on that fancy vacation, that expensive restaurant, so we could build something solid. And it worked. 10 years into our marriage, we bought our first house. A beautiful red brick home with a front porch and a backyard where I planted roses, hydrangeas, and those pink azaleas that bloom every spring. It was in a quiet neighborhood, full of trees, where kids played in the street without a care in the world. It was our dream come true. In that house, I raised my 2 children. Marcus, my firstborn, came along when I was 28. A healthy, curious boy who loved taking things apart just to see how they worked. He'd disassemble his toys just to understand them and then put them right back together. Today, he's 35, a mechanical engineer at a tech company here in Charlotte, Married to Jennifer, a sweet girl I love like my own daughter. They gave me 2 beautiful grandbabies, Ethan and Sophia. 7 years later, Olivia came along, my baby girl. A little thing with dark curls and big eyes who was pure determination from day one. She went to law school, graduated with honors from Duke University, and now she's a corporate lawyer at a big firm. 28 years old, single, focused on her career. She was always like that, independent and strong. Harold was always a present father. He took the kids to their baseball games, helped with homework, went to all the parent-teacher meetings. On vacations, we'd take road trips to Virginia, to Tennessee, places that fit our budget. And everything just seemed right, you know? Normal, happy. But there was that ritual. Thursdays, 4:15 in the afternoon, the Carolina First Bank. I remember the first time I realized it had become a fixed routine. It was about 18 years into our marriage, when Marcus was 7 and Olivia was 4. It was a fall Thursday, leaves starting to turn yellow outside, and I was in the kitchen making oatmeal raisin cookies with the kids. Harold walked through the living room, grabbed his car keys, and Olivia asked in that little high-pitched voice of hers, "Daddy, where are you going?" He just smiled at her, ruffled her curls, and said he was going to take care of a few things at the bank. Be back in a bit. And he was. He came back an hour later, like always, with that calm look of a man who'd fulfilled an important duty. And every Thursday was just like that, religiously, rain, shine, snow. It didn't matter. 4:15 in the afternoon, he was out the door to the bank. Over time, it became so normal I didn't even pay it any mind. It was just like him brushing his teeth before bed or drinking black coffee every morning, part of the wallpaper of our lives. And on the rare occasion I did ask, especially in the early years, he'd always give me that kiss on the forehead and say it in that calm, reassuring way that made me feel like everything was under control. And so, over the years, we saved money. A lot of money. We weren't rich, mind you, but we were careful. We saved on everything. I packed a lunch for work instead of eating at the school cafeteria. Harold drove the same Toyota Camry for 14 years before buying another used car. We fixed things instead of throwing them out and buying new. When Marcus and Olivia went to college, they got partial scholarships, but we covered the rest with our own sweat. And just like that, after 3.5 decades of hard work, of sacrifices, of passing up on luxuries to secure our future, we'd done it. Harold always told me our savings were doing great, that we had safe investments, that our retirement was guaranteed. He'd talk about numbers I didn't quite understand. Stocks, mutual funds, fixed income. But I trusted him. He was the accountant. He knew what he was doing. $538,000. That was the number Harold told me we had saved over our life together. $538,000. It sounded like a fortune to me. For someone who'd grown up in hand-me-downs and sharing a room with 3 sisters, that number was proof that we had made it, that we'd done everything right. Our house had been paid off for 12 years. No mortgage, no debts. It was ours, completely ours. When I turned 60, I sat on that front porch with a cup of tea and looked out at the garden I'd tended for decades, at the red bricks that had sheltered my family, and I felt this deep, profound peace. We'd done it. We had built a good, honest, solid life. But then came that Thursday. The Thursday that changed everything. It was September 21st. A beautiful fall day, with that crisp air and bright blue sky. The trees on my street were a festival of colors, orange, red, yellow. I'd woken up early, like always, and made coffee. Harold came down around 6:30, already dressed for work in a black suit and a burgundy tie. He was only working part-time now since he'd turned 70, but he still went into the office 3 times a week. We had breakfast together in the kitchen. An omelet, toast, orange juice, the same old thing. He read the paper. I looked over the grocery list. We talked about silly things, the weather, last night's football game, how Marcus was bringing the grandkids over for supper on Saturday. Everything was so normal, so ordinary, so fake, as I was about to find out. Harold left around 8:15 like always, gave me a kiss on the cheek and said he'd be back late afternoon. I waved from the window as he got in his car and drove off, disappearing around the corner. And then I was alone in the house, just like every other Thursday. I spent the morning doing the usual chores, washed the breakfast dishes, threw a load of laundry in, watered the plants on the porch. Around 11, I sat down in the living room with a book I'd been trying to finish for weeks, but I couldn't focus. There was this strange little restlessness in my chest, you know? The kind of feeling you can't put your finger on, but it's just there, bothering you. At 3:10, Harold came home. He always got back around that time on Thursdays, 'cause he left the office early those days. He came through the front door with that easy manner of his, hung his jacket on the coat rack in the hall, and went straight to the bathroom. Freshened up, changed his shirt, ran a comb through his grayin' hair. And then, at exactly 4 o'clock, he came down the stairs, picked up his car keys from the coffee table, and turned to me with that little smile. I was sitting on the sofa, pretending to read, but really I was watching him. And he walked over to me, leaned down, and gave me that kiss on the forehead. The ritual kiss. And he said, like always, "I'm just securing our future, darling." And then he left. I heard the car start, heard the engine fade down the street, and there I was, alone again. I looked at the clock on the living room wall. 4:07. In 8 minutes, he'd be at the Carolina First Bank. Like always. Doing whatever it was he did there every week for 42 years. I don't know what came over me in that moment. I don't know if it was that uneasiness I'd been feeling all day, or if it was some kind of intuition I'd been ignoring for far too long. But I got up, went to the front window, and just stood there, looking out at the empty street. The dry leaves danced on the asphalt in the wind. A dog barked in the distance, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, made myself a cup of tea, tried to calm that awful feeling, but I couldn't. I went back to the living room, sat back down on the sofa, and just waited for him to come home, because he always came home, always back around 6:30, with that air of a job well done. But on that day, before he came back, before I had the chance to ask him anything, to question anything, my life fell apart, and it fell apart in a way I never, ever could have imagined. It was 5:20 in the afternoon when I heard a car pull up out front. I thought maybe it was Harold coming back early, but when I looked out the window, I saw it was the mail truck, and the mailman, Mr. Williams, a black man in his 50s who I'd known for decades because he'd been delivering mail on my street forever, was getting out with a thick envelope in his hand. He rang the doorbell. I opened the door, and he greeted me with that same warm smile he always had. But there was something different in his eyes, a tension, a worry. He handed me the envelope and a clipboard and said I needed to sign for it. It was certified mail. I signed, thanked him, and closed the door. I just stood there in the hall, holding that big, heavy envelope. The return address was a law firm I'd never heard of, Henderson and Ross, Legal Group. Their office was downtown. My heart started beating faster. My hands were trembling. I didn't know why, but something in my gut already knew this wasn't good. I walked back to the living room, sat on the sofa, and carefully tore open the envelope. Inside was a stack of papers, maybe 10, 15 pages, and on the very first page, in big black letters, it said, "Notice of foreclosure, notice of foreclosure." My blood ran cold. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Foreclosure? But our house was paid off 12 years ago. We didn't owe a penny to anyone. This had to be a mistake, some kind of terrible error. I started reading the document. The words just swam on the page. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it thumping in my ears. And then, as I read, as I understood, I felt the floor just drop out from under me. The document said that in February of that year, 9 months ago, a loan had been taken out using our house as collateral. A loan for $164,500. And that since then, not a single payment had been made. Not one. The debt had grown with interest and penalties. And now the bank had the right to take our home, to put us out on the street, to sell our property to get their money back. I read it again and again, trying to make it make sense, trying to find the mistake, some explanation. But there was no mistake. Right there on the third page was a copy of the signature. My signature. Dorothy Ann Mitchell, on the loan agreement. A signature I had never, ever made. I had never seen that document before in my life. I had never taken out any loan. I had never agreed to put our home up as collateral for anything. But there it was, my name, my signature, or something that looked just like it. The tears started to burn in my eyes. My throat tightened up. I couldn't breathe right. I grabbed the document with both hands, clutching the paper so tight it crinkled at the edges, and I tried to process what it meant. Someone had forged my signature. Someone had used my name to get $164,500. And that person had put our home, the home Harold and I had built together, that we'd paid for with so much sacrifice, at risk. And now, we were going to lose everything. But who? Who would do something like that? And then, like a bolt of lightning in the dark, the answer came to me. Cold, brutal, obvious. Harold. Harold, who handled all our finances. Harold, who had access to all our papers. Harold, who knew my birthday, my social security number, every last detail of my life. Harold, who went to the bank every Thursday at precisely 4:15 for 38 years. No, it couldn't be. Not him. Not my husband. Not the father of my children. Not the man who slept next to me every night, who kissed me every morning, who had built this life with me. But the proof was right there, in my hands, black and white, cold and unforgiving. I got up from the sofa, stumbling. My vision was blurry with tears. I went to the kitchen, splashed cold water on my face, tried to calm myself down. But I couldn't. My whole body was shaken. My legs could barely hold me up. I leaned against the sink, taking deep breaths, trying not to panic. And then I heard it. The sound of his car pulling into the garage, the engine cutting off, the car door shutting. Harold was home from the bank. I looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. 6:30. Right on time. He'd done his ritual. He'd gone to the Carolina First Bank at 4:15, and now he was coming home to me, to continue this lie. I heard the back door open, his footsteps coming inside, his voice calling out, "Dorothy? Honey, I'm home." I wiped the tears with the back of my hand. I grabbed those papers from the living room table, folded them, and quickly hid them in the drawer of the sideboard. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. But I couldn't confront him now. Not yet. Not without understanding more. Not without a plan. Harold appeared in the kitchen doorway, that easy smile on his face, his hands in his pockets, his glasses reflecting the light from the window. And he looked at me and asked, in that calm voice of his, "What's for supper, sweetheart?" And me, with a strength I didn't know I had, I forced a smile. I swallowed the tears, swallowed the anger, swallowed the despair. And I answered, "I was thinking we could order pizza tonight. What do you think?" He agreed, said pizza sounded great, and then he went upstairs to change his clothes, whistling softly, like he always did when he was in a good mood. And I just stood there, alone in the kitchen, with my hand on the drawer where I'd hidden the foreclosure papers, with my heart in pieces, with the certainty growing in my chest. My husband had betrayed me. He had stolen from me. He had put our home at risk, and I had no earthly idea what else he'd done. But I was going to find out. Oh, I was going to find out everything. And when I did, Harold was going to regret the day he ever crossed the wrong woman. That night was the longest night of my life. We ordered pizza just like I'd suggested. Half sausage, half vegetable, just the way Harold liked it. The delivery boy showed up around 7, and we sat in the living room to eat, with the TV on the local news. Traffic reports, the weather forecast, some story about the city council elections. I wasn't paying attention to any of it. Every bite of pizza I took tasted like cardboard. Harold ate peacefully, making comments about something he'd seen at work, talking about a new client his boss had landed. I'd just make little sounds of agreement, nod my head, pretend I was listening. But my mind was 1,000 miles away. It was in that sideboard drawer where I'd hidden those papers. It was on that forged signature, on the $164,500 someone had stolen in my name. When we finished eating, he gathered up the pizza boxes, threw them in the trash, and said he was going to take a shower. He went up the stairs whistling that damn little tune he always whistled when he was happy, and I just sat there on the sofa, my hands shaking, waiting for him to be out of the way. The second I heard the shower turn on upstairs, I jumped up. I went to the sideboard, opened the drawer as quietly as I could, and took out the papers again. I had to read everything. I needed to understand every last detail. I sat down at the kitchen table, away from the stairs where I could hear him if he came down, and I spread the papers out in front of me. There was the foreclosure notice, of course, but there were also copies of other documents attached. The original loan agreement, dated February 8th of that year, 9 months ago, a Thursday. I remembered that day. It had been a normal day. I'd gone to the grocery store in the morning, had lunch with my friend Margaret, and come home mid-afternoon. Harold was at work, or so I thought. The contract said the loan was from United Community Bank, not the Carolina First Bank, where Harold went every Thursday. That was interesting. Why did he go to a different bank? And the contract was signed by me and by him. 2 signatures. Both forged, I was sure of it, because I had never laid eyes on that thing before. I kept reading. There was a letter from the bank, dated 3 weeks ago, saying they had tried to contact us multiple times about the missed payments, but got no response. That they'd called the phone number on file and sent mail to the address, but everything was either returned or ignored. And so, they had no choice but to start the foreclosure process. But I'd never gotten any letters before this one. I'd never gotten a single phone call. How was that possible? And then I saw it. In the contract, under the contact information section, there was a phone number I didn't recognize. It wasn't our home phone. It wasn't my cell. It was some other number. And the mailing address was wrong, too. It wasn't our house. It was a P.O. box. P.O. Box 5129, Charlotte, NC 28202. Harold had used false information. He had made sure that all communication from the bank went to places I would never see, where only he would have access. My God, this was planned, carefully planned, for months, maybe for years. I heard the shower shut off upstairs. My heart leaped into my throat. I quickly gathered all the papers, folded them up again, and stuffed them back in the drawer. I ran back to the living room, sat on the sofa, and grabbed the remote, pretending I was watching TV. Harold came down about 10 minutes later, in his pajamas, his hair still damp. He sat down next to me on the sofa, put his arm around my shoulders, and we just sat there watching some cooking show that was on. I could feel the warmth of his body, smell his soap, feel his breath near me, and I felt sick. I felt rage. I felt this urge to scream, to confront him, to demand answers. But I couldn't. Not yet. Because if I confronted him now, without all the information, without a plan, he'd just lie his way out of it. He'd manipulate me. He'd make it seem like it was all a big misunderstanding. Or worse, he'd hide everything, destroy the evidence, and I'd never find out the whole truth. So I just sat there, quiet, pretending everything was fine, pretending I was still that naive Dorothy who believed every word that came out of his mouth. Around 9:30, we went up to bed. I laid down on my side of the bed, just like I had for 42 years. Harold laid down on his, turned off his bedside lamp, and gave me a goodnight kiss on the cheek, and then he rolled over and fell asleep. In less than 15 minutes, I could hear his deep, steady breathing, almost a snore. How could he sleep so soundly? How could he lie there next to me, knowing what he'd done? I stayed awake, my eyes wide open in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house, the clock in the living room chiming the hour, the occasional car passing outside, the wind in the trees in the backyard. My mind wouldn't stop. It just kept going over and over everything I knew, trying to piece it together. If he'd taken out a loan for $164,500 in February, where was that money now? What had he done with it? And was that all? Was there more? I had to investigate. I needed to see our financial documents. I needed to get into the accounts. But Harold had always handled all of that. He had the passwords, he had the access. I'd never worried about it because I trusted him. What a fool I'd been. I waited until I was absolutely sure he was sound asleep. It must have been 11 p.m., maybe midnight. And then, ever so carefully, I slipped out of bed. I put my feet on the floor slowly, avoiding any noise. I grabbed my robe from the chair and put it on. and I tiptoed out of the room. I went down the stairs, skipping that one step that always creaks, and went straight to his office. Harold's office was on the first floor, in a little room that used to be the kids' playroom. When Marcus and Olivia grew up and moved out, he turned it into his space. It had a big, dark wood desk, a leather chair, shelves full of accounting and finance books, metal file cabinets, and his computer. I closed the office door gently and turned on the little desk lamp, which cast a soft, yellow glow. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel the pulse in my neck. If he woke up and came downstairs, how would I explain what I was doing in here in the middle of the night? But I had no choice. I needed answers. I started with the desk drawers. The first one was locked. Of course. But I knew where Harold kept the key. In a little ceramic pot on the bookshelf, hidden among other knickknacks. I got the key, opened the drawer, and started looking through it. There were folders. So many folders. Organized alphabetically, like everything Harold did. Taxes, insurance, retirement, investments, bills. I grabbed the investments folder first and opened it up. Inside were bank statements, but not from the Carolina First Bank. They were from other banks. United Community Bank, BB&T Bank, Wells Regional. Banks I didn't even know we had accounts with. I started reading the statements, and what I saw, it made me feel like I'd been punched right in the gut. The account at United Community Bank, the same one the foreclosure loan came from, showed a deposit of $164,500 on February 8th, the day the contract was signed. So the money had come in. But right after that, over the next few weeks, there was a series of withdrawals. 6,200 here, 9,700 there, 15,800 over there. Transfers, cash withdrawals, payments. And by June, just 4 months later, the account was empty. He had blown through $164,500 in 4 months. I grabbed another folder, credit card bills, and this is where it got even worse. There were cards I'd never heard of, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, all in the name of Dorothy Mitchell, my name. But I had never applied for these cards. I had never used them. I opened the statements, and I nearly fell out of the chair. One card had a balance of over $41,000, another one almost $36,000, 2 more with balances just as high. I added it all up in my head, my hands shaken. It was over $100,000 in credit card debt, in my name. On cards I had never even held in my hand. The charges were for everything. Electronics, expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, hotels, airline tickets, jewelry. And there was a pattern that kept repeating. Online gambling sites, Royal Bet Casino, Quick Win, Bet Zone, Fortune Play. Harold was gambling, betting, and losing a fortune. Oh my God. Oh my God. I kept searching, frantic now, opening folder after folder. And then I found the worst one of all. It was a thin folder, almost hidden at the very back of the drawer, under everything else. It was labeled in Harold's handwriting, Emergency, Do Not Open. I opened it. And inside was the statement for our retirement account. The account that was supposed to have the $538,000 he'd always told me we had. Current balance, $0.00. The account was empty, completely empty. I had to clap my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. Tears burned my eyes, streaming down my face. I was shaking all over. My legs went weak and I had to grab the edge of the desk to keep from falling. $538,000. A lifetime of work, a lifetime of saving, a lifetime of sacrifice. All of it was gone. I took the statement in both hands and looked at the transactions. It had started 4 years ago. Small withdrawals at first, 6,200, 13,400. Then it got bigger, 27,500, 38,200. And in the last 6 months, it had been a bloodbath. 64,000 at once, 89,300 another time, until there was nothing left. And where did all that money go? I looked at the transfer destinations, and most of them were to those same online gambling companies. Royal Bet Casino, Quick Win, sites that promised easy fortunes and took everything from addicted people. Harold had an addiction, a gambling addiction, and he had destroyed our financial life because of it. No, it wasn't just that. He had used me. He had forged my signature. He had opened credit cards in my name. He had put our house up as collateral for a loan that only he benefited from. He didn't just have an addiction. He was a criminal, a thief, and I was his victim. I sat down in the office chair, holding those papers, and I cried. I cried silently, with my hand over my mouth, my shoulders shaken. I cried for the life I thought I had, for the marriage I thought was real, for the future that had been stolen from me. But in the middle of the tears, in the middle of the pain, something else started to grow inside me. Something cold, something hard, something I had never felt with such force before. Rage. Pure, gut-wrenching, uncontrollable rage. Harold had done this to me, to the woman who had stood by him for 42 years, the woman who had raised his children, who had cared for his home, who had sacrificed her own dreams and plans to build a life with him, and he had thrown it all away. Literally thrown it away on online gambling sites. But no, I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I wasn't going to sit here and cry and accept this as my fate. I wasn't going to let him continue this charade. I was going to fight. I was going to find out everything, and I was going to make him pay. I wiped the tears with the back of my hand, took a deep breath, and I started to act. I grabbed my cell phone, which I'd brought with me, and I started taking pictures. Pictures of every single document, every bank statement, every credit card bill, every page of that empty retirement statement, photo after photo, making sure everything was readable, that I'd captured every single detail. It took me almost an hour of taking pictures in the middle of the night, with my heart in my throat, listening for every sound in the house, terrified that Harold would wake up and come downstairs. When I was done, I put everything back in the folders exactly as it had been. Put the folders back in the drawer in the right order, locked the drawer, put the key back in the little ceramic pot, turned off the lamp, and then I left the office, closing the door softly behind me. I went up the stairs, skipping the creaky step again, and went back into the bedroom. Harold was still asleep, rolled over on his side, snoring lightly, without a single care in the world. I took off my robe, got back into bed, and laid down. It was almost 3 a.m, but I couldn't sleep. I just laid there, staring at the ceiling, with my phone hidden under my pillow, with all those pictures saved, and I started to think, to plan. I couldn't confront Harold alone. He'd deny it. He'd make excuses. He'd convince me I was misunderstanding things, just like he always did whenever I'd questioned him over the years. He was good at that, good at manipulating, good at making it seem like I was the crazy one, the dramatic one, the one seeing things that weren't there. No, I needed help. I needed someone who would understand what was happening, someone who could guide me, someone who would be on my side. Marcus. I had to talk to Marcus. My son was an engineer, a man of logic and reason. He loved his father, yes, but he loved me too. And he would understand. He would see the evidence, and he would understand. I waited for the sun to come up, just lying there, counting the minutes, watching the dawn light start to creep in through the window, hearing the birds start to sing outside. At 5:30 a.m, Harold woke up. He yawned, stretched, and got out of bed. Went to the bathroom, did his morning routine, and went downstairs for coffee. I pretended to be asleep. I kept pretending until I heard him leave the house around 7:45, heading off for the Sunday morning golf game he always played with his friends. The second I heard his car pull away, I jumped out of bed. I grabbed my phone, went into the guest room for privacy, closed the door, and I called Marcus. He answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was sleepy, a little hoarse. It was Sunday morning. He was probably sleeping in. I told him I needed to talk to him, urgently, that it was about his father, that I had discovered something terrible and I needed his help. I could hear his voice turn alert immediately. He asked me what happened, if everything was okay, if I was hurt. I told him I couldn't explain over the phone, that I needed him to come to the house, today, now, before his father got back. There was a pause, and then Marcus said he was on his way. He'd be there in half an hour. I hung up and sat on the edge of the guest room bed, shaken, It wasn't from the cold. It was from nerves, from fear, from anticipation. Because I knew that the moment I told Marcus what I'd discovered, there was no turning back. Things would start to move, things would start to change, and my life, my marriage, everything would never be the same again. But that's what I wanted, wasn't it? I wanted justice. I wanted the truth. I wanted Harold to pay for what he'd done. Yes, that's what I wanted. 32 minutes later, I heard Marcus's car pull up out front. I ran to the door and opened it before he could even ring the bell. He was standing there, in jeans and a t-shirt, his hair still a mess, with that worried look on his face that reminded me of when he was a little boy who'd gotten hurt playing. He came inside, gave me a tight hug, and asked what had happened. And I, with my voice breaking, with the tears coming back, I said, "Your father stole from us, Marcus. He stole everything." Marcus just stood there in the entryway, staring at me like he hadn't quite understood what I'd just said. He blinked a couple of times, ran a hand through his hair, and repeated, "Mom, what do you mean he stole from us?" I closed the door behind him, peeked out the window to make sure Harold hadn't come back unexpectedly, and took my son's hand. I led him into the kitchen, away from the front windows, where we'd have more privacy. I sat him down in a chair and sat next to him, clutching my phone with the pictures I'd taken in the middle of the night. I took a deep breath, and I started to tell him. I told him about the foreclosure notice that had arrived the day before, about the $164,500 loan I'd never taken out with my forged signature, about how I'd laid awake all night, thinking, trying to understand, and about how I'd gone into Harold's office in the early hours of the morning and discovered the whole complete nightmare. Marcus listened in silence. His eyes just got wider and wider. His jaw got tighter and tighter. I could see the emotions playing across his face: disbelief, confusion, shock, and then anger. When I finished talking, I showed him the pictures on my phone, one by one. The statements from banks I didn't know, the bills from credit cards in my name with massive debts, the proof of the online gambling, and finally, the worst of it all, the statement from the empty retirement account. Marcus took the phone from my hand carefully, like it was something that might explode, and started zooming in on the photos to get a better look. He spent several minutes there, in absolute silence, just swiping through the screen, reading every detail. And then he put the phone down on the table, put his elbows on it, and buried his face in his hands. I heard him take a deep breath, once, twice, trying to get himself under control. When he finally lifted his head and looked at me, there were tears in his eyes. And he said, his voice hoarse and shaky, "How could he do this? How could he do this to you? To us?" I didn't have an answer. I just shook my head, feeling my own tears welling up again. We just sat there, mother and son, crying together in the kitchen, trying to process the sheer scale of the betrayal. It was Marcus who broke the silence first. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, straightened his back, and that determination I knew so well came into his eyes. He'd taken after me more than Harold, thank God. When there was a problem, he didn't run from it. He faced it head on. He asked me where Harold was. I told him he'd gone to play golf, that he probably wouldn't be back until noon, maybe 1 o'clock. We had time. Marcus then said we had to act fast, that we needed professional help. This wasn't just a marital spat or bad money management. This was a crime, fraud, identity theft, forgery, and we needed a lawyer, a good one. I agreed. But I also told him I was scared that if we moved too quickly, Harold might destroy evidence, or worse, he might disappear with whatever money was left, if there was any left at all. Marcus thought for a moment, and then he said he knew someone, a lawyer who'd worked with his company on some corporate cases. Her name was Victoria Hayes. She had a reputation for being tough, smart, and specialized in financial law and fraud, and she was trustworthy. He took out his phone and called her right then and there, in my kitchen. It was Sunday morning, not even 9 o'clock yet, but he called anyway. It went to voicemail. He left an urgent message asking her to call him back as soon as she could, that it was a family emergency. While we waited, Marcus went to the fridge, got a bottle of water, and poured us both a glass. We drank in silence. I looked at my son, this 35-year-old man, this brilliant engineer I had raised, and I felt a mix of pride and sadness. Pride because he was here, supporting me, being strong when I needed him. Sadness because he was a victim, too. His father, the man he'd looked up to, the man he thought was a pillar of integrity, had turned out to be a common liar. 10 minutes later, Marcus's phone rang. It was Victoria Hayes calling back. Marcus answered, briefly explained the situation, and asked if she could possibly see us today, urgently. There was a pause while he listened to her answer, and then he said yes, we could be there right away. He thanked her, hung up, and looked at me. She'd said she didn't normally take appointments on Sundays, but given the seriousness of the case and because it was Marcus asking, she'd make an exception. She would be at her office in an hour. An address downtown on the 15th floor of an office building on Trade Street. I ran upstairs, changed my clothes, put on a charcoal gray blouse and navy pants. I put my hair up in a bun, put on a little lipstick. I wanted to look composed, serious, credible. I didn't want this lawyer looking at me and seeing some hysterical, dramatic woman. I was in control. At least I was going to pretend I was. I grabbed a folder with some important papers I'd kept over the years. Birth certificates, the deed to the house, that original foreclosure notice. Marcus would bring the digital evidence on his phone. I left a note for Harold on the kitchen counter, saying I'd gone out shopping with Marcus and would be back later. A lie. But he couldn't suspect a thing. Not yet. Marcus drove. We got on the highway to downtown Charlotte, and the 25-minute drive was mostly silent. I just stared out the window, watching the suburbs give way to the tall buildings of the city center, trying to get my thoughts in order. What was I going to say to the lawyer? How was I going to explain I'd been so blind for so long? How was I going to admit that I had trusted him completely without ever questioning a thing? We got to the building at 9:10. A modern building, all glass and steel, with an elegant white marble lobby and a security guard at the front desk. Marcus gave our names at reception, and we were cleared to go up. We took the elevator to the 15th floor. Victoria Hayes' office was at the end of the hall, Hayes & Partners, law firm. A frosted glass door with the name in gold lettering. Marcus rang the bell. The door buzzed open, and we went inside. The reception area was small but sophisticated. Light gray walls, black leather armchairs, a glass table with perfectly arranged magazines. A young blonde woman, who must have been the secretary, sat behind a desk and greeted us with a professional smile. She said Ms. Hayes was expecting us and led us down a short hall to a conference room. Victoria Hayes stood up as we entered. She was a black woman, maybe in her early 40s, with short curly hair, thin-framed glasses, and dressed in an impeccable gray suit. She had a presence that immediately inspired confidence. She shook Marcus's hand first, then mine, and invited us to sit at the large conference table that dominated the room. She started by asking how she and Marcus knew each other. They exchanged a few words about a corporate case from a couple of years back, and then she looked at me with these intelligent eyes and said, "Mrs. Mitchell, Marcus tells me you're facing a very serious situation. Please, tell me everything from the beginning." And I told her, again, this time with more detail. About Harold, about the 42 years of marriage, about how he'd always controlled the finances, about the mysterious ritual of going to the bank every Thursday, about the foreclosure notice, about the discoveries from the night before, everything. Victoria listened without interrupting. She took notes on a yellow legal pad with a gold pen, occasionally nodding or slightly furrowing her brow. When I finished, she asked to see the evidence. Marcus passed her his phone with the pictures I'd taken. Victoria zoomed in on each one, studied them carefully, and made more notes. After about 10 minutes of reviewing everything, she finally put the phone down on the table, took off her glasses, and looked me directly in the eye. And then she said something that made my blood run cold. "Mrs. Mitchell, what your husband has done isn't just morally wrong. It's criminally wrong. This is bank fraud, identity theft, document forgery. Embezzlement. Every single one of these crimes could result in federal charges with significant prison time." Prison. Harold could go to prison. I swallowed hard. Marcus took my hand under the table and squeezed it. Victoria kept talking, explaining in legal terms what each crime meant, what the potential sentences were, how the process would work. She said the first thing we needed to do was protect what was left, that if Harold found out we knew, he could try to hide or destroy more evidence. Or worse, he could take out more fraudulent loans, running up more debt before he was stopped. So she suggested a plan. We would gather more evidence over the next few days, complete documentation of everything. She would hire a private investigator to track where the money had gone, and she would start preparing a formal petition with the authorities. But there was one question she needed me to answer honestly. A difficult question. She asked, "Mrs. Mitchell, do you want to press criminal charges against your husband?" Silence. I looked at Marcus. He looked at me. And then I looked back at Victoria. The truth? I didn't know. Part of me wanted to see him suffer, wanted to see him pay for what he'd done. I wanted justice. But another part, the part that still remembered the man I had loved, the father of my children, it hesitated. Victoria must have seen my indecision. She leaned forward and said, gently but firmly, "I understand this is difficult. He's your husband, the father of your children. But I need you to understand something. If we don't act, if we let this go, he will continue. Men like him, with gambling addictions, they don't stop on their own. They always think the next bet will be the big one, and he will destroy you completely. He'll destroy your children too." That's when Marcus spoke for the first time since we'd entered the room. He looked at Victoria and asked if it was possible that he had been a victim too, if Harold could have used his name for something. Victoria's face grew serious. She said yes, it was very possible. That in cases of family fraud, the perpetrator often uses the names of multiple family members to maximize the money they can get. And then she suggested that Marcus check his credit. Immediately. Marcus took his laptop out of his backpack, opened it up, and logged into a credit monitoring site he had an account with. He typed in his information, waited for it to load, and when the page opened with his report, his face went white. He turned the screen towards me and Victoria, and there it was. Marcus had 2 debts he had never taken out. A credit card from Bank of America with a balance of $16,900, and a personal loan from PNC Bank for $30,700, $47,600 in fraudulent debt in my son's name. Marcus didn't say a word. He just stared at the screen with this look of absolute shock. And then he snapped the laptop shut, stood up from his chair, and started pacing back and forth across the room. I could see the emotions warring on his face. Anger, betrayal, disbelief. And finally, when he stopped pacing and looked at me, I saw the decision in his eyes. He said, "Mom, we need to press charges. He did this to you. He did this to me. God knows if he did this to Olivia too. This man is not my father anymore. He's a criminal." And in that moment, hearing my son speak those hard but true words, I knew what I had to do. I looked at Victoria Hayes and said, with a firmness that surprised even me, "Yes, I want to press charges. I want him to pay for everything he's done." Victoria nodded. She said she would start immediately, but we had to be smart. We couldn't confront Harold yet. We couldn't give him any sign that we knew. We needed time to build an airtight case, to gather all the evidence, to make sure nothing could be destroyed. She said she'd contact an investigator she worked with, and that we needed to act normal at home. I had to continue being the wife Harold thought I was, as painful as it would be. I asked her how long we'd have to keep up this charade. How long until we could act, Victoria thought. And then she said probably 3, maybe 4 weeks. Enough time to document everything, to trace the money, to prepare the legal papers, and to coordinate with the authorities. 3 or 4 weeks of living a lie. 3 or 4 weeks of sharing a bed with a man who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. I didn't know if I could do it, but I had to. The meeting lasted another hour. Victoria walked us through every step of the process, explained what would happen, what our rights were, what our options were, and at the end, as we stood up to leave, she took my hand and said something I'll never forget. She said, "Mrs. Mitchell, you are stronger than you think, and when this is all over, you are going to come out the other side not as a victim, but as a survivor." We left her office with a folder full of papers to sign, instructions to follow, and a plan of action. Marcus drove me back home. On the way, we stopped at a diner and had lunch, but neither of us had much of an appetite. The food tasted like nothing. When we got back to the house, it was almost 1:30 in the afternoon. Harold's car was in the driveway. He was back from golf. My heart started pounding. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and put on my mask. We walked in the front door. Harold was in the living room watching TV, a beer in his hand. He looked over at us with that casual smile and asked where we'd been. I said in a perfectly calm voice that we'd gone shopping at the mall, that Marcus needed a few things and had asked me to come along, that we'd had lunch out. A normal thing, no big deal. Harold accepted it without question and turned his attention back to the TV. Marcus gave me a tight hug, whispered in my ear that it was going to be okay, and left. I stood there, alone with Harold, with the man who had destroyed my life, and I went into the kitchen to start fixing supper, as if it were just any other Sunday, as if my world hadn't just ended. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of my life. Every morning, I woke up next to him. I saw that face on the pillow beside me, that face I had kissed thousands of times, and I had to swallow the anger, the disgust, the urge to scream in his face everything I knew. I had to get up, smile, make coffee, and pretend that everything was normal. It was like I'd split into two people. The Dorothy he saw, who was still the devoted wife, the perfect homemaker, and the real Dorothy, who was seething on the inside, planning, waiting for the right moment to strike. Victoria had been clear. No confrontations, no letting him get suspicious. We needed him to stay confident, to think he'd fooled everyone, so he wouldn't destroy evidence or try to run. So I acted my part. I fixed his favorite meals. I asked about his day at work. I watched TV with him every night, and every Thursday, at precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I watched him walk out the door to go to the bank, keeping up that damned ritual. But while I was pretending, I was also working with Victoria behind the scenes, building the case against him. The private investigator Victoria hired was named David Sullivan, a black man in his 50s, an ex-cop with that serious, capable air of a man who's seen it all. He came to my house the Monday after our meeting with Victoria while Harold was at work. David spent hours in Harold's office with specialized equipment, copying documents, backing up computer files, tracking passwords. He was methodical and careful, making sure to leave everything exactly as he found it, without a single sign that anyone had been there. And what David found was devastating. He showed me everything at a meeting in Victoria's office 3 days later. He brought a laptop and projected a presentation he'd prepared onto a big screen. Me, Marcus, and Olivia, who I'd called to join us because she needed to know too, sat around the table as David laid out the crimes of our father, our husband. The online gambling had started 6 years ago. Small bets at first. $125 here, $180 there. But it had escalated quickly. Within 3 years, Harold was betting thousands a week, and losing. Always losing. He had tried to cover his losses by taking money from the retirement account. First, it was small withdrawals he disguised as investment reallocations. But when the gambling debts kept growing, he started taking out more and more, until he had completely drained the $538,000. When the retirement account was gone, he turned to credit cards. He opened 4 cards in my name, forging my signature on the applications. He used that P.O. box address to get the cards without me knowing, and he ran up $112,300 on those cards, all on gambling. But the worst was yet to come. David clicked to the next slide, and what came up made me feel like I'd been slapped across the face. Harold had also used Olivia's name, my daughter, my baby girl. He had opened 2 credit cards in her name, forging her signature just like he'd done with mine. $39,500 in fraudulent debt. Olivia, who was sitting next to me, let out this strangled sound. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filling with tears. Marcus, on the other side of the table, slammed his fist down so hard that David's laptop jumped. But David wasn't done. He clicked again, and he showed us that Harold had tried to take out a second loan using our house as collateral. This one had been denied because the first fraudulent mortgage was still open and in default. But he had tried. He had tried to put our home at risk again. And there was more. Harold had opened a secret bank account in his name and mine, with a forged signature where he deposited part of his salary before it ever hit our real joint account. An account I never knew existed, and he'd used that account to hide even more of his spending. In total, between the debts, the loans, and the stolen money, Harold had destroyed nearly $785,000. $785,000 that should have been our comfortable retirement, that should have helped our kids, our grandkids. When David finished his presentation, the silence in the room was heavy as lead. Olivia was crying softly. Marcus's jaw was so tight I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. And me? I had moved past shock into a coldness I didn't know I was capable of feeling. Victoria was the one who broke the silence. She said she had good news and bad news. The good news was that we had more than enough evidence for a solid criminal case. David had documented everything. We had copies of every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every stolen dime. The U.S. Attorney's Office was going to love this case. The bad news was that recovering the money would be nearly impossible. He had lost it all to offshore gambling sites in Caribbean islands where it would be impossible to trace or get the funds back. At best, we could get the fraudulent debts in our names erased, but the retirement money that had been legitimately his and mine, that was gone forever. Olivia asked me, her voice thick with tears, "Mom, what do we do now?" And Victoria answered for me. She said it was time to act, that we had enough evidence, that she had already prepared the documents and coordinated with the Charlotte Police Department and the U.S. Attorney's Office. Now we just had to decide how and when to make the arrest. I knew exactly how and when. I looked at Victoria and I said, "Thursday, at 4:15 in the afternoon at the Carolina First Bank." Marcus looked at me, confused, and I explained. For 38 years, Harold had gone to that bank every Thursday at the same time, saying he was securing our future. It was a lie, all of it, but I wanted his end to happen right there. I wanted to shatter that ritual. I wanted him to be humiliated in the one place he thought he was untouchable. Victoria considered it for a moment, and then she smiled, a small but approving smile. She said she thought it was poetic, and that she would make it happen. The next few days were a refined kind of torture. I went on with my normal life. I cooked, I cleaned, I smiled. And inside, I was counting down the hours to Thursday. Harold suspected nothing. He continued his routine, kept going to work, coming home, having supper with me, watching TV. And every night when he fell asleep beside me, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that was about to happen. Marcus came for dinner on Monday. Jennifer and the kids, too. Harold was in a great mood, playing with his grandkids, telling funny stories from work. It was such a normal, perfect family scene that if you didn't know the truth, you'd never imagine that man was a criminal. But I knew, and Marcus knew, and we communicated with glances across the dinner table, glances that said, 3 more days, just 3 more days. Wednesday night, lying in bed, I wondered if I should feel sorry for him, if I should feel any remorse for what was going to happen the next day. I looked at his profile in the dark, listening to his deep breathing, and I tried to find some remnant of the love I'd once felt, but I found nothing. Just anger, just coldness, just determination. He had done this to himself. He had chosen his addiction over his family. He had chosen to lie and steal instead of asking for help, and now he was going to pay the price. Thursday dawned clear and cold. It was early November, and Charlotte was in that time of year when fall gives way to winter. The trees were almost bare, the sky had that pale, clean blue, and the air had a crispness that gave you goosebumps. I woke up before the alarm, 5:30 a.m. Harold was still asleep. I went downstairs, made coffee, and sat in the kitchen with a hot mug in my hands, looking out the window at the backyard. Today was the day. Today, everything would change. Harold came down at 6:30, like always. We had breakfast together, an omelet, toast, orange juice. He mentioned it was going to be a quiet Thursday at work, that he might come home early, that maybe we could do something nice over the weekend, maybe go to a nice restaurant, take a little getaway. I smiled and said that sounded lovely. A lie. He left at 8:15, gave me a kiss on the forehead, told me he loved me, and drove away. The second his car disappeared around the corner, I ran to the bedroom and got dressed. I put on a black sheath dress, elegant but understated. I put my hair in a low bun. I put on the pearl earrings my mother had given me. I looked in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman looking back. There was a hardness in her eyes I'd never seen before. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Marcus arrived. He was going to drive me to the bank. Victoria would meet us there, and so would the police. We didn't talk much on the way. Marcus drove with focus, his hands tight on the wheel. I just stared out the window, watching the city go by, trying to calm my heart, which was beating faster and faster. We arrived at the Carolina First Bank at 1:45. The bank was on a busy corner in the financial district, a glass and granite building with its blue and gold logo shining in the sun. We went in through the back parking lot, where Victoria had told us to wait. 5 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up next to us. Victoria got out, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, a leather briefcase in her hand. She greeted us with a professional nod and said everything was in place. The police were already inside the bank, in plain clothes, waiting for the signal. She asked me if I was ready, if I was sure. I looked her in the eye and answered, "I've never been more ready in my life." The three of us walked in together. Victoria in front, me and Marcus right behind. The bank lobby was moderately busy. About 15-20 customers in line for the tellers, others sitting in waiting areas, a few at the customer service desks. Victoria led me over to the manager's desk, in the right corner of the lobby. It was a semi-private area with a large desk and chairs for clients. The manager, a middle-aged Asian man in a navy suit, stood up as we approached. Victoria identified herself as a lawyer and said we were there for an urgent matter related to bank fraud. The manager immediately got serious. He invited us to sit and asked how he could help. Victoria briefly explained that a crime was about to be reported right here, in this location, in a matter of minutes, and that she had already coordinated with the authorities. And then I took my position. I stood next to the manager's desk, where I had a clear view of the bank's main entrance. Marcus stood beside me, holding my hand. Victoria stood a little behind, checking her phone, probably communicating with the police. 3:55, 4 o'clock, 4:05. Every minute felt like an hour. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My palms were sweaty. I took a deep breath, again and again. And then, at 4:14, I saw him. Harold Mitchell walked through the glass doors of the Carolina First Bank, softly whistling that annoying little tune he always whistled. He was wearing a black suit, a burgundy tie, his leather briefcase tucked under his arm. Walking with that confident stride of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. He glanced around absent-mindedly, probably looking for the shortest line. And then his eyes found me. The whistling died on his lips. He stopped walking. His expression shifted from casual to confused in a split second. He blinked, as if he wasn't sure what he was seeing. And then he started walking towards me, a hesitant half-smile on his face. But the smile vanished when he saw who else was there. Marcus. Victoria Hayes, who he didn't know, but who clearly looked like a figure of authority. And then, when he was about 10 feet away, I saw the exact moment he realized. 2 men in suits who had been sitting near the tellers stood up and started walking towards him. And a woman in a blue blazer, who had been pretending to fill out a form at a kiosk, also turned and moved towards him. Police. Plainclothes. But Harold knew. The survival instinct that every human has kicked in. His blood ran cold. I saw it happen. I saw the color drain from his face. I saw his pupils dilate. One of the officers, a tall white man in his 40s, stopped in front of Harold. He flipped open his wallet and showed his badge. And then he said, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear, "Harold Mitchell, you're under arrest on suspicion of bank fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement." The entire bank froze. Conversations stopped. Customers turned their heads. Employees stopped what they were doing. Everyone was staring at the scene unfolding in the middle of the lobby. Harold stammered something. Tried to say it had to be a mistake, that he hadn't done anything. His eyes searched for mine, desperate, begging. But I just stared back, cold, unmoving. The other officer grabbed his arm and turned him around. And then, with practiced, efficient movements, he put the handcuffs on his wrists. The metallic click of the cuffs echoed through the silent bank. Harold tried to turn, tried to see me, and he yelled, "Dorothy! Dorothy, what's happening? Help me!" But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, watching as the man who had destroyed my life was led away by the police. The female officer started reading him his rights, something about the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, but I wasn't listening to the words. I was just watching Harold being led to the exit in handcuffs, his head hung low, while everyone in the bank watched. And as he passed by me, so close I could smell his aftershave, he whispered, "How could you do this to me?" And I, for the first time since he'd walked into the bank, spoke, softly, just for him to hear. I said, "You did this to yourself." And then he was gone, out onto the streets of Charlotte, into a police car, into the justice system that would judge him for his crimes. I stood there, in the middle of the Carolina First Bank, on a Thursday afternoon at 4:15, surrounded by silent witnesses, and I felt something I didn't expect to feel. Peace. A cold, calm peace, because I had done what needed to be done. I had sought justice, and I hadn't given in to the cowardice of letting it go. Marcus put his arm around me. Victoria put a hand on my shoulder. And the three of us walked out of the bank together, leaving behind the place that had been the stage for Harold's ritual of lies for 38 years. Outside, the November sun was shining, cold and bright. The sky was a relentless blue, and I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the fresh air. The game was over, and I had won. Harold's arrest made the front page of the local Charlotte papers that weekend. Local accountant arrested for defrauding his own family. That was the headline in the Charlotte Observer on Saturday morning. There was a picture of him being led to the police car, handcuffed, his head bowed, trying to hide his face. I didn't buy the paper. I didn't have to. My neighbors brought copies over. My friends called. Everyone wanted to know if it was true, if I was okay, what had happened. I didn't say much. Just that I'd discovered some financial irregularities and had taken the appropriate legal steps. I kept my dignity. I wasn't about to become neighborhood gossip any more than I already had. Harold was held at the Mecklenburg County Jail over the weekend, waiting for his bail hearing on Tuesday. Victoria called me Sunday night to fill me in on the next steps. She said the process would be quick because our evidence was so solid that the U.S. Attorney's Office was impressed with the documentation David Sullivan had put together, but she also warned me about something. She said Harold would try to make a deal, that he'd likely plead guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence, and that I needed to prepare myself for what was coming. Because when it came time for sentencing, I would have to make a choice. I would have to testify. I would have to look him in the eye in a courtroom and tell them the impact his crimes had on my life. I asked if it was mandatory, if I could just let justice run its course without getting more involved. Victoria was kind, but firm. She said it wasn't technically required, but my victim impact statement would be crucial, that it would make a difference in the sentence, that the judge would want to hear from me. I agreed. I said I'd do whatever was necessary. On Tuesday morning, me, Marcus, and Olivia went to the Mecklenburg County Courthouse for the bail hearing. The building was imposing, gray stone, with those columns that make you feel the weight of the law just by looking at them. We went through security, up to the 3rd floor, and into a packed hearing room. There were reporters, curious onlookers, a few of Harold's co-workers, and his public defender, a bald man in his 50s in a worn brown suit, nervously shuffling through papers. Harold was brought in through a side door by 2 bailiffs. He was wearing the orange jail jumpsuit. No handcuffs now, but he still had that defeated posture. His eyes scanned the room and found me. I saw the plea in his face, the shame, the desperation, but I didn't look away. I held my head high, showing him I was no longer the woman he could manipulate. The judge came in. A white man in his 60s, gray hair, reading glasses. Judge Robert Chen. Victoria had told me he was known for being fair, but tough on white-collar crime. The hearing began. The prosecutor laid out the formal charges. Bank fraud, identity theft, forgery. Each charge read aloud, with the dollar amounts, the dates, the victims. The public defender argued that Harold was not a flight risk. that he had deep roots in the community, that he deserved a reasonable bail to prepare his defense. The prosecutor countered that Harold had shown a systematic pattern of deceit, that he had forged documents from multiple family members, that he was a risk to commit more fraud if he was released. Judge Chen listened to it all, and then he set bail at $320,000 with electronic monitoring and a restraining order. Harold was not to have any contact with the victims, which included me, Marcus, and Olivia. Harold didn't have $320,000. Of course he didn't. He didn't have any money at all, so he went back to jail, and I went home to wait. In the weeks that followed, Victoria and David kept digging, and every day they found more. There was always more. David found that Harold had lied on our federal income tax returns for 4 straight years. He'd hidden income, claimed false deductions, omitted gambling winnings. More charges were added. We found out he had tried to take out personal loans using the names of his nephews, his sister's kids who lived up in Kentucky. The loans were denied, but he had tried. His sister, when she found out, cut off all contact. The whole family took sides. Harold's mother, an 81-year-old woman in a nursing home, was devastated. She called me crying, apologizing for her son, saying she didn't understand how he'd gotten to this point. I was gentle with her. It wasn't her fault. I told her she'd always be welcome in my home, no matter what Harold had done. Meanwhile, I had to rebuild my own financial life. Victoria filed petitions to have the fraudulent debts in my name canceled. We had to prove, with handwriting experts, that the signatures were forged. We had to provide alibis showing I wasn't present when the documents were signed. It was a long, stressful process, but slowly, things got sorted out. The banks and credit card companies cooperated. None of them wanted the bad press. One by one, the debts were forgiven. The $164,500 loan was nullified. The foreclosure was canceled. The credit cards were wiped clean. Marcus and Olivia got their names cleared too. Their fraudulent debts were forgiven. Their credit was restored. But the retirement money, that was never coming back. $538,000 lost forever in online casinos. Victoria tried to trace it, but it was impossible. The money was just gone. I would have to accept that. I'd have to find another way to live. But at least my house was safe. At least my name was clean. 4 weeks after the arrest, Victoria called with news. Harold had decided to take a plea deal. He would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a single, unified sentence, rather than face a jury trial where he could get separate sentences that would add up to much more time. His public defender had negotiated it. If Harold confessed to everything publicly, in court, under oath, the prosecutor would recommend a sentence of 10 to 14 years in federal prison. Victoria asked me what I thought. She said the decision wasn't technically mine, but my opinion mattered. I was the primary victim. I thought about it for a long time. 10 to 14 years. Harold would be between 80 and 84 years old when he got out. An old man with no money, no reputation, no family. But was it enough? Was it justice? I told Victoria I accepted the deal. But on one condition. I wanted Harold to confess to everything in court. I wanted to hear every crime he committed come out of his own mouth. I wanted it on the official record. Victoria said she'd make it happen. The plea hearing was set for the 3rd week of November, less than 2 months after I'd gotten that first letter. I spent Thanksgiving with Marcus, Olivia, Jennifer, and the grandkids. We made the traditional dinner: turkey, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie. The kids played, and for the first time in weeks, I was able to relax a little. I was able to feel that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. Harold spent Thanksgiving in a jail cell, alone, as he deserved. The plea hearing was set for November 18th. I had exactly 1 week to prepare myself for what was about to happen. Victoria called me into her office on a Monday, 4 days before the hearing. She wanted to prep me for the process, to explain everything, and to help me write my victim impact statement. I sat in the same conference room where I'd been months ago, when this all began. But it was different this time. I was no longer that scared, confused, shell-shocked woman. I had become something harder, stronger, more determined. Victoria spent almost 2 hours explaining how the hearing would work. Harold would stand up and plead guilty to each crime under oath. The prosecutor would ask questions. The judge would make sure he understood everything. And then, before the sentence was handed down, I would have my chance to speak, to tell the entire court the impact his crimes had on my life. She gave me a document with examples of statements other victims had made. She said I could use it as a guide, but the most important thing was to be authentic, to speak from the heart. And then she said something that stuck with me. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is your chance to get your voice back. He took so much from you. Don't let him take this too." I took the document home. I spent that entire night sitting at my kitchen table with a pen and a legal pad, trying to put into words what I felt. How do you sum up 42 years of a marriage that turned out to be a lie? How do you describe the feeling of having your identity stolen, your signature forged, your trust shattered? How do you explain the pain of discovering that the man you loved was a stranger? I wrote. I erased. I wrote again. I cried. I tore up pages. I started over. By the time the sun came up on Tuesday morning, I had a statement. 3 pages, handwritten, words that came from the deepest, most wounded place inside of me. Marcus came for dinner Tuesday night. I asked him to read what I'd written. I wanted his opinion. I wanted to know if it made sense, if it was too harsh, too weak. He read it in silence, sitting in the living room, and when he finished, he had tears in his eyes. He just looked at me for a moment before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was thick. He said it was perfect, that it was exactly what Harold and the judge needed to hear. But then he asked if I was sure I wanted to do it, that it was going to be incredibly hard to see his father again, to say all of that in front of everyone. I thought about his question, and then I answered with a certainty that surprised me. I said I had to do it, not for Harold, for me. I needed to look him in the eye and say it all. I needed that closure. Marcus gave me a tight hug, and he said he'd be there with me, that he and Olivia would be sitting right behind me, that no matter how hard it got, I wouldn't be alone. The days crawled by. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, the weekend, and then it was Monday, November 17th, the day before the hearing. I didn't sleep that night. I just laid in the dark, going over what I was going to say in my head, imagining what it would be like to see Harold again, stealing my heart so it wouldn't fall apart when the time came, because I couldn't fall apart. Not in front of him, not in front of the court. I had to be strong. I had to show him that he hadn't broken me completely. Tuesday, November 18th, dawned cold and gray. A fine mist was falling over Charlotte, the kind that doesn't really get you wet, but just leaves everything damp and dreary. I got dressed carefully. I put on a simple black suit, pulled my hair into a tight bun, light makeup, simple earrings. I wanted to look serious, credible, dignified. Marcus and Olivia picked me up at 8. The hearing was at 10:15, but Victoria wanted us there early. She wanted to go over everything one last time. The drive downtown was quiet. My kids knew I needed the silence, that time to center myself, to gather my strength. We got to the federal courthouse at 9:10. We met Victoria in the lobby. She was in a navy blue suit, leather briefcase in hand, that professional yet comforting look on her face. We went to a small private room, and there, Victoria walked me through it all again, explained every step, when I would speak, where I would stand, how to address my words to the judge, not to Harold. She also warned me about something. She said Harold would probably cry. He would beg for forgiveness. He would try to appeal to my sympathy, and I couldn't let it get to me. I had to remember everything he had done. I agreed. I told her I was prepared, but I wasn't. No one is ever really prepared for something like this. At 10 o'clock, we entered the courtroom. It was a large room, high ceilings, dark wood benches, the Great Seal of the United States hanging behind the judge's chair. There were about 30 people there, reporters, onlookers, a few of Harold's old colleagues. We sat in the front rows, me, Marcus, and Olivia in one line. Victoria in the row behind us, ready to step in if needed. At 10:05, Harold was brought in. He came through a side door, escorted by 2 marshals, still in his orange prison jumpsuit. The handcuffs were removed as he sat at the defense table next to his public defender. He'd lost weight. His hair was grayer, almost white at the temples. His posture was that of a broken man. He looked around nervously until his eyes found mine. And in that moment, I saw it all there. Shame, remorse, fear, and maybe deep down, a silent plea for mercy. But I looked away. I stared straight ahead, at the seal on the wall, anywhere but at him. At 10:15 sharp, the bailiff called for everyone to rise. The judge entered. Elizabeth Morrison, a white woman in her 60s, in a black robe, her gray hair in a bun, glasses perched on her nose. Victoria had said she had a reputation for being fair but having no patience for lies. She sat, banged her gavel once, and told everyone to be seated. The hearing had begun. The prosecutor stood up first, a young black man in a dark blue suit with that confident posture of someone holding a winning hand. He read the formal charges, one by one, in excruciating detail that made my stomach turn. Bank fraud in the amount of $164,500. Identity theft of Dorothy Mitchell, Marcus Mitchell, and Olivia Mitchell. Forgery of documents. Embezzlement of $538,000. Tax evasion. Every word fell like a stone in the silent room, and then the judge turned to Harold and started asking questions. If he'd been advised by his lawyer, if he understood he was giving up his right to a jury trial, if he understood the consequences. Harold answered yes to everything. His voice was hoarse, trembling. I could hear it from where I sat, and then the judge asked the final question. How did he plead to all these charges? There was a pause. Harold took a deep breath, and then he said the words I'll never forget. Guilty, Your Honor. Guilty to all charges. Guilty to everything. A murmur went through the room. The judge banged her gavel for silence, and then she said something that caught me by surprise. She said that before she accepted his plea, she needed to hear from his own mouth, in detail, every crime he had committed, that she needed to be sure he fully understood the nature of his actions. Harold looked at his public defender, who gave a slight nod. And then Harold began to speak. With a shaken voice, looking down most of the time, he told them everything. He told them how the gambling addiction had started 6 years ago, how it started small and just grew, how he'd used the retirement money first, thinking he could win it back. He explained that when the retirement ran out, he panicked. The gambling debts were piling up. He was getting pressure from sites threatening to sue. And that's when he crossed the line. He forged my signature for the first time to open a credit card. And then he couldn't stop. It was more cards. The loan against the house, the cards in Marcus and Olivia's names, digging himself a deeper and deeper hole, always thinking the next big bet would fix everything. When he got to the part about using his children's names, his voice broke completely. He stopped talking, put his hands over his face, and began to cry. Sobs that shook his shoulders. The public defender gave him a moment. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the sound of his crying. And then he continued. He confessed to lying on the tax returns, to hiding income, to every dime he'd stolen, every document he'd forged, every lie he'd told. It took almost 40 minutes of a detailed, meticulous, devastating confession. When he finished, the judge asked a few more questions to make sure everything was clear. And then she said she accepted his plea, that Harold was formally found guilty on all charges. And then she looked at me, those piercing eyes behind her glasses, and she said, Mrs. Mitchell, I understand you have prepared a victim impact statement. If you wish, you may address the court now. My heart pounded. This was it. My turn. My chance to speak. To say everything I had held inside for months. I stood up, my legs trembling slightly. I took the 3 pages I had written, and I walked to the lectern that faced the judge. I looked at Judge Morrison. I took a deep breath, and I began to read. I said that my name was Dorothy Ann Mitchell, that I had been married to Harold Mitchell for 42 years, 41 years in which I believed I was building a life with a partner, someone I loved and respected, but that today I had discovered I had lived a lie for more than 4 decades. And then I went deep. I talked about how he hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen my security, my trust, my dignity. He had forged my name, turned my very identity into a tool for his crimes. I told them how every time I signed a legitimate document, every time I used my own credit honestly, I was living inside the lie he had built around me. How every happy memory I thought we had shared was now stained. I talked about my job, about 29 years as a teacher, waking up at 5:30 every morning, grading papers late into the night, saving every penny because I thought I was building a secure future. A future he destroyed. My voice started to shake when I got to the part about the $538,000, about how that number had represented a lifetime of sacrifice, and how he had thrown it all away, literally gambled it away on websites, chasing an illusion. I paused. I took a sip of water someone had put at the lectern, and then I talked about the worst part, about Marcus and Olivia, about how he had used his own children, about what kind of father does that. I saw Harold out of the corner of my eye. His head was bowed, his shoulders shaken, crying again. But I kept going. I said that I had been forced to make impossible choices, that I had to choose between protecting the man I had loved for more than 40 years and protecting myself, that I had chosen justice. Because if I didn't, what message would I be sending to my children, to my grandchildren? And then I got to the hardest part, the part I had rewritten 5 times the night before. I talked about how he had stolen more than money or security. He had stolen my ability to trust people. That for months after I found out, I looked at everyone with suspicion, my friends, my neighbors, because if he, the person closest to me, could betray me so completely, then who else could? I said that I had anxiety attacks, that I was in therapy twice a week, that I took medication to sleep, that my brain just wouldn't shut off, replaying all the signs I had ignored. And then, my voice getting stronger, firmer, I said something I had thought a lot about. I said he had stolen my memories, that every happy moment I thought we'd shared was now poisoned. That beautiful anniversary dinner, he had just drained $27,500 from our savings. That Christmas he gave me pearls, probably bought with a fraudulent credit card. Every kiss, every promise, all of it was a lie. I saw Judge Morrison taking notes. Her face was professional, but I saw something in her eyes, understanding, maybe even anger on my behalf. I spoke for a few more minutes, about how I would have to rebuild, about how it would take time, maybe years, but that I would be okay, that our children would be okay, and that when Harold got out of prison, many years from now, he would find that the world had moved on without him. And then I came to my conclusion, the last words I had written. I looked directly at Harold for the first time since I'd started talking. He lifted his eyes. They met mine. And I saw it all there. Genuine remorse, pain, shame. And then I said the words I had rehearsed. This is what you deserve. This is justice. I walked back to my seat. Marcus put his arm around me. Olivia held my hand. And I let the tears fall. Judge Morrison was silent for a long moment. She reviewed her notes. She looked at Harold. She looked at me. And then she began to speak. She said she had seen many fraud cases in her career, but that family fraud cases were always the most painful, because the betrayal came from where there should have been love and protection. She talked about trust, about how it was the bedrock of society, and about how when someone violates that trust, especially within their own family, the damage goes far beyond the financial. She spoke for about 10 minutes, about accountability, about consequences, about how a gambling addiction was a real illness, but it was not an excuse for crime. And then she said she would hand down the sentence, that she had studied the documents, heard the confession, heard my testimony, and that she had taken it all into account. My heart was pounding. This was it. The moment Harold would hear how many years he would be locked away. The judge opened her mouth to speak, and then something happened that no one expected. Not even me. I stood up. I don't know what came over me. I hadn't planned it. I hadn't discussed it with Victoria. But something inside me, in that exact moment, made a decision. I stood up and I said, "Your Honor, may I say one more thing?" The judge looked surprised. She hesitated, glanced at the prosecutor, who looked just as confused. And then she said yes. I could speak. I took a deep breath, and then I started talking again. But this time, there was no script. It was coming straight from my heart, raw and unfiltered. I said, Your Honor, I have spent the last few months filled with anger, with hate, wanting to see this man suffer for what he did, and part of me still does. But I paused. The words were hard to find. But I'm also a mother. And Marcus and Olivia, they've already lost so much. They've lost their trust in their father. They've lost the image they had of their family. And if their father goes to federal prison for 10, 12, 14 years, they'll lose more. They'll lose any chance of ever maybe finding some kind of peace with this. I saw Marcus and Olivia staring at me, shocked. Victoria had stood up, clearly confused about where I was going with this. And I realized something, I continued. The justice I was looking for was the truth. It was for him to be exposed, for everyone to know what he did. And that's happened. His name is ruined. His reputation is destroyed. The financial institutions know. The court knows. Everyone knows. I glanced at Harold. He was staring at me, with this look of utter disbelief. Sending him to prison for over a decade isn't going to give me my money back. It's not going to give me my trust back. It won't erase the trauma. It will only cause more pain. For my children, for his grandchildren, for his 81-year-old mother who doesn't deserve to watch her son rot in a federal prison. The room was dead silent, everyone hanging on my every word. And then I said the thing that would change everything. Your Honor, I would like to withdraw my criminal complaint. I don't want him to go to prison. Chaos erupted in the courtroom. The prosecutor shot to his feet, protesting. Reporters started whispering frantically. Even the judge looked stunned. Marcus grabbed my hand, whispering, asking if I was sure what I was doing. Olivia had tears in her eyes. The judge banged her gavel several times, calling for order. And when the room finally quieted down, she looked at me with those piercing eyes and asked if I was sure. If I understood that I was giving up the possibility of seeing the defendant incarcerated? I said yes. I was sure. That I wasn't doing it because he deserved forgiveness. I was doing it because I deserved peace. And carrying the weight of knowing I had sent the father of my children to prison would haunt me for the rest of my life. The prosecutor kept protesting. He said these were federal crimes, that the state had an interest in prosecuting, that even if the primary victim withdrew her complaint, the case could proceed. But the judge held up a hand, silencing him. She thought for a long moment, and then she said she would grant my request. That given the unique circumstances of the case, and given the fact that the defendant had confessed completely, and that the primary victim was asking for leniency, she would issue an alternative sentence. Harold would not go to federal prison, but he would serve 12 years of strict probation, 3 years of electronic monitoring. He would have to perform 650 hours of community service. He would have to attend a treatment program for his gambling addiction. And he would have to pay restitution, even knowing it would take him decades to do so. And most importantly, a restraining order. Harold was not to contact me or Marcus and Olivia. He was not to come near the house. Any violation would result in immediate imprisonment. When she banged the final gavel, sealing the decision, the room exploded. Half the people looked shocked. The other half looked outraged. Reporters scrambled out to report the news. Harold was still sitting there, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. His public defender was smiling, clearly surprised, but relieved. Victoria came over to me, pulled me into a corner. She asked me what on earth had happened, why I had changed my mind like that at the last second without telling anyone. I told her the truth, that I hadn't planned it, that it was a split-second decision, that the moment the judge was about to pronounce the sentence, something inside me realized I didn't want that. I didn't want to carry the weight of having completely destroyed his life. Marcus and Olivia came over, and the conversation we had right there in the courthouse hallway was one of the hardest of my life. Marcus was torn. Part of him understood. Part of him thought I'd been weak. Olivia was more shocked than anything. She couldn't believe that after everything, I had let him off the hook. But I explained. I explained that it wasn't about whether he deserved it or not. It was about what I needed to move on. And I needed to let go of that anger, that desire for revenge. Because if I didn't, it would eat me alive. Harold was released that same afternoon, with an ankle monitor, with a long list of restrictions, with his life completely destroyed even without stepping foot in a federal prison. And me? I went home, exhausted, confused, but strangely relieved, because I had made a choice, and it was my choice, not the legal system's, not what society expected, mine. And now I had to see what came next. That evening was strange, in a way I can't even begin to describe. I got home around 6. Marcus and Olivia had driven me, but they didn't come in. They needed to process what had happened. I needed to, as well. So I said my goodbyes at the door, went inside, and shut the house behind me. The silence was heavy, different from the silence of the past few months, when I knew Harold was in jail and I was alone by choice. This was a silence of anticipation, because I knew he was coming back. For the first time in nearly 2 months, Harold was coming back to this house, and I was ready for it. While I was at the courthouse, while all that chaos was happening after my decision, I had asked Victoria to do something for me. I'd asked her to draw up the divorce papers, urgently, to have them ready by the end of the day. She'd asked if I was sure, if I didn't want to wait a few days, process everything first. But I was firm. I told her I was more sure of this than anything else in my life. Because you see, I had withdrawn the criminal complaint. I had asked for mercy. I had saved him from years in a federal prison. But that didn't mean I forgave him. It didn't mean I forgot. And it sure as heck didn't mean our marriage was going to continue. Victoria had understood. She made a few calls right there in the courthouse hallway, and around 5 o'clock, a courier had delivered a thick envelope. The divorce papers, already prepared, already reviewed, just waiting for signatures. So now I was home, with that envelope on the coffee table, waiting. The court officer had said Harold would be processed and released around 7:30, that he'd probably come straight home since his ankle monitor was programmed with this address as his authorized residence. I used that time to prepare myself. I took a long shower, changed into something comfortable, sweatpants and a long-sleeved shirt, pulled my hair into a simple ponytail. I had nothing left to prove. I didn't need a black suit and perfect makeup. I went down to the kitchen and made tea. Chamomile. I sat at the table, sipping it slowly, trying to get my thoughts in order, trying to prepare the words I would say when he arrived. Because I had withdrawn the complaint, yes, but not for him, for me, for my children, for my own peace of mind. And he needed to understand that. He needed to understand that even without prison, our life together was over. Around 7:15, I heard a car pull up out front. My heart jumped. I set my teacup down with a hand that was shaken just a little, and I waited. I heard the front door open. His key still worked. I hadn't changed the locks. Technically, it was still his house too, until the divorce was final. I heard his footsteps in the hall, slow, hesitant, like he wasn't sure he should even be coming in. And then he appeared in the living room doorway. Harold looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 months. The orange jumpsuit was gone, replaced by the clothes he'd worn the day he was arrested. That black suit now hung loose on his thinner frame. His hair was whiter. His skin had that gray pallor of someone who hasn't seen enough sun. And there was the ankle monitor, that bulky black thing on his left ankle, visible where his pant leg had ridden up. He just stood there looking at me, and I looked back. 2 strangers who had been married for 42 years. He was the one who spoke first. His voice was hoarse, thick with emotion. He said, "Dorothy, I don't even know where to start. What you did today, I don't deserve it. I know I don't deserve it." I didn't answer right away. I let the silence hang there for a moment. And then, in a calm voice that surprised me, I said, "You're right. You don't. I didn't do it for you." I saw the confusion on his face. He took a step into the room cautiously, as if he expected me to change my mind at any second and call the police back. He tried to explain. He started talking about remorse, about how he would spend the rest of his life trying to make it up to me, about how he'd been seeing a prison psychologist and understood so much more about his addiction, that he would do the mandatory treatment, that he would change. I listened to it all in silence. And when he finished, when he just stood there waiting for me to say something, I simply pointed to the coffee table. I said, "Sit down." He sat in the armchair, the one that had always been his. I stayed on the sofa, and I picked up the envelope that had been sitting there since I got home. I slowly opened the envelope, took out the documents, and placed them on the coffee table between us. I slid them towards him. Harold looked at the papers, not understanding at first, but when he saw the heading, Petition for Dissolution of Marriage, his face went white. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a sudden desperation, and he started shaking his head. He said my name, not once, but several times. Dorothy, 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 as if repeating it could change what was happening. And then he started to beg. He said, I had just saved him, that I'd shown him mercy, that it had to mean there was still hope, that we could rebuild, that he would dedicate every day he had left to earning back my trust. I let him talk. I let him pour it all out. And when he finally stopped, when he just sat there with tears streaming down his face, I began to speak. I said, Harold, I need you to understand something very clearly. What I did in court today was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was not a second chance. It was a choice I made for my own peace of mind and for the well-being of our children. He tried to interrupt, but I held up a hand. I did not want to carry the weight of knowing I sent you to prison for the rest of my life, not because you deserved it or not, but because I deserved to live without that weight. I deserved to move on without all that anger consuming me. I took a deep breath before I went on. But that doesn't change a single thing you did. It doesn't erase the lies. It doesn't bring back the money. It doesn't restore the trust. You destroyed our marriage, Harold. You destroyed it completely, and it can't be fixed. He started to cry harder now, those deep, wrenching sobs that made his shoulders shake. And part of me, the part that still remembered who he had been, or who I thought he had been, felt a pang of pity, but I couldn't let it weaken me. You are going to sign those papers, I said, my voice getting firmer. You're going to sign them because it's the very least you can do, because I gave you your freedom, and now you are going to give me mine. Harold picked up the documents with trembling hands. He flipped through the pages, but I doubt he was really reading them. The tears were probably blurring everything. And then he looked at me again and made one last attempt. He said we'd built a life together, that we had 42 years of history, that we had children, grandchildren. That family was forever, that he had made mistakes, yes, terrible crimes, but deep down he still loved me. He always had. And that's when I said something I'd thought a lot about over the past few weeks. I said, if you loved me, Harold, you would have asked for help. 6 years ago, when the addiction started, you would have come to me and said, Dorothy, I have a problem. I need help. And I would have been furious. It would have been hard, but we would have dealt with it together. I paused, letting that sink in. But you didn't ask for help. You chose to lie. You chose to steal. You chose to use my name, our children's names, to fund your addiction. You chose to betray me in every way possible. And now you want me to believe that was love? No, love doesn't do that. The silence that followed was heavy. Harold had no answer, because there was no answer. Everything I'd said was the truth, and he knew it. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, he picked up a pen that was on the table, and he started to sign, page after page, each signature seeming to tear a piece out of him. When he was done, he pushed the documents back towards me, and then he asked, his voice barely a whisper, what would happen now, where he would go, because the restraining order said he couldn't live here. I told him Victoria had already arranged it, that he would be staying in a small temporary apartment, the rent paid for 3 months with what was left of his old accounting pension, that after those 3 months, he was on his own. He would have to get a job, pay his own bills, rebuild his life from scratch. And then, I said the last thing I had to say to him that night, you have 1 hour to get your things and leave. Clothes, personal documents, whatever you need. But just 1 hour. After that, I'm locking the door, and you will not be allowed back in. Harold nodded. He stood up slowly, as if every movement hurt, and went upstairs to the bedroom. I heard him opening drawers, filling suitcases. I heard the sounds of his life being packed away. I sat in the living room the whole time. I didn't go up to help. I didn't go see what he was taking. I just waited. 45 minutes later, he came downstairs. He had 2 large suitcases and a backpack. Everything he had decided to take. Everything that was left of 42 years of marriage. He stopped in the hall, the bags at his feet, and looked at me one last time. It looked like he wanted to say something. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and then finally, he said, "I'm sorry, Dorothy, for everything. I know it doesn't mean anything now, but I am. I'm so sorry." And I, with an honesty that surprised me, said, "I know you're sorry. I believe you are. But being sorry doesn't unbreak things. It doesn't get back what was lost. It just shows that you finally understand what you destroyed." He nodded. He picked up his bags, and he walked out the front door. I didn't get up. I didn't go to the window to watch him leave. I just heard his car, which had been released from the police impound, start up. I heard the engine sound fade away. And then, silence. Real silence this time. Not of anticipation, but of finality. I stood up from the sofa. I walked to the front door. I locked it. I put the chain on. And then, for some reason I don't fully understand, I leaned against the door and just started to cry. It wasn't a sad cry. It wasn't because I missed him. It was relief. It was exhaustion. It was the weight of months of tension finally being released. I cried for a good 10 minutes right there, leaning against the door. And when I stopped, when I wiped my face and took a deep breath, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Freedom. Real freedom. Not just the absence of him, but the presence of possibility, of a future that was entirely mine to make. I went to the kitchen. I made more tea, and I sat at the table looking around my house. My house now. Just mine. And for the first time in months, I smiled. The days that followed were strange. The house felt bigger, quieter, but it wasn't a bad quiet. It was a quiet full of possibility. The divorce was finalized quickly. Victoria said that with the criminal confession and both parties agreeing, the judge would likely sign off in a matter of weeks. And sure enough, 4 weeks after that night, I received the final papers. 41 years of marriage, officially over with a few signatures and a stamp. I didn't cry when the papers came. I just put them in a folder, filed them away, and moved on. But there was one thing I still hadn't told my children. Something I'd kept secret for more than 25 years. And now, it felt like the right time to reveal it. I scheduled a dinner at my house on a Saturday in January. Marcus, Olivia, Jennifer, and the kids. I made baked ziti, their favorite since they were little. Salad, garlic bread, and an apple pie for dessert. The kids played in the yard after we ate, even in the January chill, and we adults sat around the kitchen table, drinking coffee, talking about little things. It was Olivia who finally asked. She has that direct way about her, probably got it from me. She asked me how I was doing financially, if I was going to be able to live on just my teacher's pension, if I needed help. Marcus immediately agreed. He said he and Jennifer could help with the bills if I needed it, that he didn't want me to struggle because of what their father had done. I looked at my 2 children, at the genuine love on their faces, and my heart just swelled with pride. Because even after everything, even with all the pain, I had raised good people, generous people, people who put family first. And then I told them I needed to tell them something I'd kept hidden for a very long time, and that now, finally, it felt right to share. They went quiet, attentive. Jennifer even put her coffee cup down, sensing it was serious. I started at the beginning. I told them how, 25 years ago, my mother had passed away. She had left a small inheritance for me and my siblings. My share had been $11,500. Not a lot, but it was something. At the time, Harold had suggested putting the money into our joint retirement account. It made sense, he'd said, a long-term investment. And I had agreed with him. At least, that's what I told him. But in reality, I hadn't. I'd done something else. Marcus and Olivia were looking at me, confused, waiting for me to continue. I told them how I had gone to a small credit union on the other side of town, one where I knew Harold had no connections. And I had opened an account in my name only, a secret account. And I had deposited that $11,500 in there. And then, over the years, whenever I had a little extra cash, $75 from a birthday gift, $125 from selling some antiques at a church bazaar, $180 from a small bonus at school, I would deposit it into that account. Never amounts big enough for Harold to notice. Never anything that would be missed from the monthly budget. but bit by bit, consistently, for over 2.5 decades. Olivia interrupted me at that point. She asked why. Why had I hidden money from her father? If I had already suspected him back then, and I was honest, I said no, not consciously, but that I had always had this little voice in the back of my head, a voice that told me I needed to have something that was just mine, something no one could take away, a safety net that depended only on me. I told her I couldn't explain where that voice came from. Maybe from growing up watching my own mother be completely dependent on my father financially. Maybe from watching friends in tough spots when their marriages ended and they had nothing in their own name. I didn't know, but that little voice had saved me. And then I told them the number. With compound interest over the years, with some conservative investments the credit union manager had helped me make, that account now had $96,800. The silence at the table was total. Marcus and Olivia just stared at me, their mouths open. It was Marcus who reacted first. He started to laugh. Not a happy laugh, a laugh of pure, utter disbelief. He said, "Mom, you basically saved yourself. Some part of you always knew." And he was right. Some part of me had always known something wasn't right, even without being able to name it, even without any real evidence. Some part of me had sensed it and had acted. Olivia wanted all the details, how I'd managed to hide it for so long, if her father had ever found out, how I'd made deposits without him knowing. I explained it was easier than it sounded. Harold controlled the finances, yes, but he had never been controlling of my routine. I had my own life, my own friends, my own errands, and he never questioned it, never asked where I'd been, what I'd done, who I'd talked to. Ironically, the blind trust I had in him, he also had in me. He never imagined I could have secrets. It never crossed his mind that I could be hiding something. And now, that $96,800 was my salvation. It wasn't the $538,000 he had stolen, but it was enough. With the help of a financial planner Victoria had recommended, I had invested the money conservatively, part in a fixed income fund, part in certificates of deposit, and part in an annuity that would give me an extra $525 a month for the next 20 years. Combined with my teacher's pension of $2,100 a month, that gave me $2,625 a month. With the house paid off and no debt, it was more than enough to live comfortably. Marcus and Olivia were so relieved. Jennifer, too. They had been so worried about my financial situation. And now they found out that not only was I going to be okay, but I had planned my own rescue decades ago without even knowing I'd need it. We talked for hours that night. About money, about secrets, about intuition. Olivia said it had changed the way she thought about relationships, that even with love, even with trust, a woman always needed to have something of her own account, her own money, her own independence. And I agreed. I told her it wasn't about mistrust, it was about prudence. It was about loving yourself enough to protect yourself. In the weeks that followed, life started to take on a new rhythm. A rhythm that was all mine. I woke up when I wanted to. I no longer had to make coffee the way someone else liked it. I no longer had to coordinate schedules or plans with anyone. If I wanted to have breakfast at 10 in the morning, I did. If I wanted to eat supper at 9 at night, I did. Little freedoms that meant the world. I started to rearrange the house. That office that had been Harold's, I turned it into an art studio. I bought an easel, paints, canvases. I started painting watercolors, something I'd always wanted to do, but never had the time. I wasn't any good. Far from it. But it was fun. It was freeing. And it was mine. I joined a yoga class at the community center. I met other women my age, some divorced, some widowed, all rebuilding their lives in some way. We became friends. We started going out for lunch after class. One of them, Margaret, 66 and a widow for 3 years, became my best friend. She had this infectious energy of someone who had decided to live every day to the fullest. And she challenged me, pushed me out of my comfort zone. It was Margaret who convinced me to do something I had never done before. Travel alone. Well, with her, but without a man. Without having to ask permission or adjust plans around someone else. We planned a trip to Wilmington, North Carolina in April. 3 days of exploring the historic city, eaten at famous restaurants, taken a ghost tour at night. And I went. For the first time in my life, at 64 years old, I took a trip that was purely for fun, not to visit family, not out of obligation, for pure joy. It was liberating in a way I can't explain. Margaret and I laughed so much on those 3 days. We walked through the historic district draped in Spanish moss. We ate shrimp and grits by the river. We did that ghost tour that was half history, half theater. And at night, lying in a bed that wasn't my own, in a city that wasn't my own, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. As for Harold, I'd hear about him occasionally. Marcus kept me informed, even though I'd told him I didn't want to know. But he thought there were some things I should know. Harold had found a job, not as an accountant. No firm would hire someone with a felony conviction for financial fraud. But he'd found work at a small accounting office, doing filing and organizing. Minimum wage, nothing like what he used to make. He was living in a small apartment on the other side of town, a tiny studio from what Marcus had seen. He was going to his gambling addiction treatment twice a week, doing his community service on the weekends, and he was paying the restitution. Small amounts, $75 a month, which was what the court had set based on his income. It would take him literally decades to pay back what he owed, but he was paying it. Part of me wondered if he had learned anything, if he was genuinely changing or just going through the legal motions. But then I'd remember that it wasn't my problem anymore, not my responsibility. He had made his choices, now he had to live with them. And me, I had made my choices too, and I was living with them, and discovering day by day that I had made the right ones. A year after that courthouse hearing, I was sitting on my front porch on a warm December afternoon, drinking iced tea and watching the leaves on the trees dance in the breeze. 1 full year since my life had completely changed, since I had made that decision that shocked everyone, including myself. And you know what? I didn't regret it. Not one bit. My life had turned into something I never imagined possible at 65. It had become authentically mine. Not the life I thought I was supposed to live. Not the life society expected, but the life I chose to create. The routine I'd settled into in those first few months had become solid. I'd wake up at 7, not 5:30 like when I was working. I'd make coffee just the way I liked it, not too strong, not too weak. I'd drink it on the porch when the weather was nice, watching the sun come up over the neighborhood trees. Then I'd tend to my garden. The roses had bloomed beautifully under my care. The azaleas were in their glory, and the little vegetable patch I'd planted in the back had given me tomatoes, bell peppers, fresh herbs, things I used in my cooking. Cooking had become a joy again, not a chore. I tried new recipes. I made dishes Harold had never liked, but that I loved. I invited friends over for supper. I turned my kitchen into a place of creativity and laughter. The yoga classes had become a key part of my week, not just for the exercise, but for the community. Margaret and I were inseparable now. We'd traveled together 2 more times, Charleston in the spring, New Orleans in the summer, and we had plans for Nashville next year. I'd also started volunteering at the public library. I helped elementary school kids with their reading. I saw those little eyes light up when they finally sounded out a hard word, and it reminded me why I had loved being a teacher. And I had started something new, too, something that surprised me. I had started writing. Not a book or anything formal, but a blog about rebuilding after betrayal, about finding strength after financial abuse, about starting over in your golden years. It had been Margaret's idea, actually. She'd said my story could help other women, that I should share it. At first, I said no. My story was private, painful. I didn't want to put my life on display like that. But then I started thinking about all the women who might be going through what I went through, who might be seeing the signs but ignoring them, who might be being financially manipulated but not know it, who might think they were too old to start over. So I started writing. Short posts at first, telling bits and pieces of my story, without naming Harold or using real names, but being honest about the feelings, about the process, about the journey. And the response was overwhelming. Hundreds of comments, women sharing their own stories, thanking me for having the courage to speak up, saying my story had given them the courage to act. One woman in particular really stuck with me. She was 51. She had discovered her husband was doing something similar. Not gambling, but hiding money and supporting a second family in another state. And she was scared. Scared to report him. Scared to be alone. Scared she couldn't start over. She sent me a private message, and we exchanged emails for weeks. I encouraged her. I gave her practical advice. I connected her with Victoria, who helped her with the legal side of things. 6 months later, she wrote to me again. She had reported her husband, she had filed for divorce, she had managed to keep the house, and she was starting therapy, starting to rebuild. And she thanked me. She said if I hadn't shared my story, she never would have found the courage. That email made me cry. But they were good tears. Tears of purpose, of knowing my pain had meant something, that it had been used to help someone else. Marcus and Olivia came for supper regularly. The kids would spend whole weekends sometimes. Ethan, who was 11 now, had started teaching me how to play video games. Sophia, who was 10, loved to bake with me. And they didn't ask about their father anymore. They'd made peace with the situation in their own way. Marcus had visited Harold once, a few months ago. It had been a difficult conversation, he told me later, but a necessary one. He told his father he didn't hate him, but he didn't forget either, that it would take time, maybe years, maybe never. Olivia still hadn't visited. She said she wasn't ready. Maybe she never would be. And I respected that. Everyone deals with betrayal in their own way. As for me, I hadn't seen Harold since that night he packed his bags and left, and I had no desire to. I didn't feel anger anymore. It wasn't that burnin', all-consuming emotion, but there was no affection either. He was a stranger now, someone I had known in a previous life. I'd hear news about him sometimes. Marcus would keep me vaguely informed. Harold was still working at that accounting office, still living in the same small apartment, still going to treatment, still paying his $75 a month in restitution, and he'd apparently gotten a girlfriend. A woman in her 50s he'd met in his treatment group, someone else fighting their own addictions. Marcus said it seemed to be a healthy thing, that they supported each other. Part of me was happy for him, not because I cared romantically, but because it meant he was moving on too, that he wasn't just rotting alone in regret, that maybe, just maybe, he had learned something. But mostly, I was happy because his life was no longer my concern. He had become irrelevant to my happiness, and that was liberating. My therapist, Dr. Anderson, had officially discharged me 3 months ago. She said I didn't need regular therapy anymore, that I had processed the trauma, that I had developed the tools to handle triggers when they came up, that I had become truly resilient. Of course, she said I could always come back if I needed to, that her door was open, but that I had done the work, I had healed. And she was right. I felt healed, not in the sense that the scars were gone. They were still there. They probably always would be, but they didn't ache anymore. They had become part of my story, part of what made me who I am now. And who am I now? I'm someone I like, someone I respect, someone who faced the worst kind of betrayal and came out the other side not as a victim, but as a survivor, as a winner. Margaret had convinced me to try one more new thing, dance lessons, ballroom dancing specifically. I'd protested that I was too old, but she just rolled her eyes and dragged me along anyway. And I found out I loved it. The music, the movement, the pure joy of dancing without a care in the world. And that's where I met William, a 72-year-old widower, a retired engineer with a kind smile and gentle eyes. We danced together a few times, then we got coffee, then we had dinner. It wasn't romance, not yet, and maybe it never will be. I don't know if I can open my heart that way again, if I can trust on that level. But it was pleasant company. It was interesting conversation. It was someone who made me laugh, who appreciated my company without expecting anything in return. And for now, that was enough. Marcus teases me about William, asks when I'm going to introduce my boyfriend to the family. I just roll my eyes and tell him he's not my boyfriend. We're just friends. But the smile on my face probably gives me away, because for the first time in a very, very long time, I felt light. I wasn't carrying the weight of the trauma all the time. I wasn't waking up every day thinking about Harold and what he did. I was waking up thinking about what color I was going to paint that day, or what book I was going to read to the kids at the library, or what new recipe I was going to try. I was waking up thinking about the future, not stuck in the past. And that was true freedom. Today, after it all began with that foreclosure notice, I live in peace in my Charlotte home. That red brick house with the roses and azaleas that survived everything, that continues to be my sanctuary, my home. Harold is living on the other side of town, working a job that pays a fraction of what he used to make, living in a small apartment, serving out his probation, paying a restitution that will take decades to complete. He didn't go to prison, but his life was destroyed anyway. He lost his family, his reputation, his status, his trust, everything. And me? I got it all back. My dignity, my strength, my life. I've learned that trust is precious, that being deceived doesn't mean you were weak. It means you were human. And that rebuilding the ability to trust after a devastating betrayal isn't naive. It's courage. I've learned that forgiveness isn't about the other person deserving it. It's about you deserving peace. I forgave Harold, not because he earned it, but because I deserved to be free from the weight of that hate. But forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean reconciling. It means letting go of the anger that consumes you and moving on. And I've learned that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the friends you make in yoga class. It's the community that embraces you. It's the people who choose to stand by your side when everything falls apart. Margaret, Victoria, Dr. Anderson, my friends from the library, my children. They are my true family. And that family is strong, unbreakable. So what would you have done in my place? Do you think I did the right thing? Do you think I should have let him go to prison? Or do you think I made the right choice by seeking peace instead of revenge? Write in the comments what city you're listening from. And if you liked my story, please leave a like on the video so the channel can keep bringing you more stories like this. Stories of real women who faced betrayal, abuse, hardship, and who chose to fight, who chose to rebuild, who chose to live. Thank you for all the kindness from everyone who followed my journey. On the screen, you'll see another story I'm sure you'll enjoy. Go ahead and click to watch. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, don't forget to subscribe, you hear? There are so many inspiring stories here. Stories of overcoming, of justice, of women who refuse to be victims. Until the next story.